What you see is oftentimes they have that moment, then they go build the product, and then they hand it off to marketing, and they're like, here's this amazing product. And marketing's like, all right, how are we going to talk about it? Like, what's the proposition? And they go do more research, and it ends up being a slightly different story than what the intent was. And then the marketing doesn't match the product that actually goes to market at the end of the day. And so I think the big challenge for a lot of these companies is how do you have that insight live with that product as it gets passed off? That's one that I think everybody has the opportunity to become better at.
Welcome to the Backcountry Marketing Podcast. Today, I'm sitting down with Steve Holmberg. He is a 17-year veteran at Nike, professor of consumer research at the University of Oregon in the sports product management program. And most recently, Steve, you've started a program called the Insight Accelerator. And we're going to be talking today all about research, developing consumer research, and how to use that to inform not only product development, but at the very end of that spectrum, also the marketing and kind of the rollout campaigns that happen once a product has been tested and developed and is ready to go out into the wild. So Steve, welcome to the show. This has been like 4 years in the making.
Yeah, it's been a while. Thanks for having me on, Cole.
It's great to see you. So folks, I'm going to give you a little bit of a little insight. When I first started the podcast, Steve was like one of the very first people that I got connected with. You were maybe like one of the first 10 people. And for whatever reason, we weren't able to record an episode back then, which is probably for the best because I like to think that the show's gotten better since those first 10 episodes. But I remember chatting with you and just being totally, because this was when you were still at Nike.
Yes.
And just being like totally blown away that like had this crazy opportunity to like get to meet someone like you and like hear about this world that I had only like dreamed about. And so, yeah, I don't know. I've always appreciated you, and I'm excited that we have the opportunity to sit down and chat.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. It's been a road listening to you sort of evolve the podcast as you've gone along, but it's been great. I'm glad to hear I'm at the beginning 10, but it's been great. So again, thanks for having me on.
Well, today we're talking all about, as I mentioned, consumer research and how that informs product. We're going to be talking about how, the when, the why, and kind of going through the details of everything that you kind of do, Steve, to develop good consumer research, to inform product, to inform marketing. I guess to kind of kick us off, like, why is this something you think about? I mean, obviously this is something you do day to day, you teach it. Yeah. Why is this something you think about? Are you passionate about consumer research?
Yeah, very passionate about consumer research, and largely because I'm passionate about the consumer. At the end of the day, when we're creating marketing campaigns or product campaigns or new designs that we're bringing into the marketplace, we're really doing it for consumers. And so it's really important for us to understand what their problems and needs are and be able to help solve those problems. And that I really like the idea that it starts with the consumer, the product creation process, and it ends with the consumer. So you take in the information, you build the product, and then they're actually the ones that make the choice at the end of the day of whether that product solves their need or not. And so I've always liked that consumer. I've always liked helping that consumer. And so that makes my job very interesting on the day-to-day.
So if you had to give a really generalized answer, how many outdoor or kind of like sports athletic brands started with like one product? And then as that company ages, can you describe the relationship that company has to consumer research and product development as a company matures? And maybe that'd be a good place to start our conversation.
Yeah, that's a great place. So it's funny to watch because a lot of times startup companies end up having a pretty strong founder that has an idea of what they want to do. And then they go basically solve that problem. And it ends up being their challenge that they end up solving for, not necessarily that they're going out and doing tons of consumer research to start, but they have a very specific consumer and it's them that they end up solving for. And so that's one path that sort of people follow. The other path is going out and talking to consumers, finding out what the problem is, and then solving that problem. The interesting thing is with those strong founders, oftentimes it can be a situation where they end up having a successful product and then they think they have all of this knowledge and they're just going to do what they want to do. But they so they launch a second product, but since they're not so tied to it or so close to it, and they're not necessarily the consumer of that product, it ends up sort of being a dud. Like it kind of fails. And where it all falls apart is that they didn't go out and do that research in order to understand what that newer consumer or evolved consumer has changed. And the whole point of doing consumer research is to create a repeatable and scalable process that is both an art and a science that is able to evolve product over time and make it better, and then also make it scalable in order to create more products and in order to grow your business. And at the end of the day, that's the whole purpose, is to grow your business and serve the consumers with the products that they need.
Hmm. Yeah. How did you end up in this world?
Yeah, I have
Tell us a little bit
I have a long roundabout story, but I'll keep it pretty short. I love motivating or seeing people go from walking to running or the couch to walking and walking to running and running to racing. I love that journey and connecting with consumers. So I went to business school to see if I could diversify my skill set in order to go into some of these companies. And fortunately, after business school, I went to Nike 17 years ago. From there, I ended up getting into marketing and was in a marketing rotational program. So got exposure to lots of different things, including consumer insights. And flash forward, I was marketing for 8 years at Nike. And then there was an opportunity that came up to move over to consumer research and consumer insights. I left a couple of months ago, and I started my own company, Insight Accelerator, which basically helps everybody not only learn how to perform effective research, but also be able to conduct research if people need it.
Fascinating. Yeah. So I guess holistically, like, what is consumer research? How do you define that?
Yeah. So I see consumer research as truly the empathy and understanding of what the consumer's thinking, feeling, and doing. So there's both an attitudinal and a behavioral side of things. And so a lot of times when you go into organizations, and we talked about the strong founder, there are a lot of points of view that people have as leadership within organizations, but consumer research is really taking the consumer's point of view first and really seeing the world through their lens. And then again, being able to solve that consumer's problem with a product at the end of the day.
And so I feel like I don't have a specific example, but when I think about sometimes when companies launch products and they just seem like they're just like not thought out, or it's a complete miss, or, they catch flack on the internet. Like, is that, I guess maybe you don't know the answer to this, but is that like because of a lack of consumer research? Or like, what are all the things that might contribute to something that's a miss?
Yeah, I think that's so there are lots of things that it could be a miss, like distribution could be a miss, or access to the product to begin with, and being able to create awareness of what the product is. But a lot of times if it's sort of a dud, if people are aware of it, they do have access to it, they can afford it, but it just doesn't serve that consumer's need, then I think that's where consumer research has really made that there's been a disconnect with the consumer, and has sort of led to this hard part.
What are I want to get into like some of the specifics about how you actually conduct research, but I'm curious before we go there, if you could talk about some of the misconceptions about research and maybe what it can provide, what it can't provide, like truly what is its purpose, what is it good at, and what are things that maybe people assume it can do, but it can't do?
Yeah. So what it's good at is exposing unrealized needs or challenges within the consumer's life. And I think that's we can talk about observation and insight in a little bit, but observations are largely seeing what consumers are doing, hearing from them, watching their behaviors. They're kind of like facts. And insights are sort of this deeper understanding of that consumer, what that challenge is. And oftentimes you think of it as the consumer research and insights is something that everybody sees. Everybody sees the same thing, but it's just thinking about that differently, and being an active sort of watcher of the world around you in order to understand that deeper problem that has to be solved. And so that's the sort of the plug-in and the role that it plays to start. And now the challenges and the misconceptions of consumer research is, one, it can only be performed by agencies, which is not true. Like if you're a marketer, if you're a product person, if you're a designer, everybody should have the capability and skill set to go out and perform basic research at the end of the day. It's the, but that being said, it takes skills to be able to do that. I think the other misconception that comes in is just doing consumer research is just qualitative research and it's just talking to people. And I can talk to people and therefore I can conduct research. And while you can go do that, there are definitely better forms to be able to make sure that you're not introducing a bunch of bias, et cetera, into the research process and getting better information back.
Interesting. So yeah, where would consumer research typically be brought into the process of developing a product? Like walk me through where a company starts and then where does consumer research enter the equation?
Sure. So at the beginning of the go-to-market process or your life cycle that you're on, the consumer research should be happening at the very beginning stage. So truly understanding if you don't have a product yet, truly understanding that consumer, what their situation is, et cetera. So it sets the foundation of how you will sort of plug in or build a product to help that consumer. And so that typically is sort of very qualitative research, very much going in depth with that consumer. And then as the product creation process goes along, you'll bring in data points from consumers, so more quantitative to understand how big is the marketplace, is there an opportunity for a broader set of people that have the same problem, and you can bring in quant on that side. And then as you sort of continue on, you can sort of figure out what are needs in different marketplaces when you try to sell in the product. Is this a product that will work in this type of market or won't it? And so you can sort of pick and choose there. And then as you go a little bit further, you start to get prototypes. Another great place to start to execute consumer research is around product trials or product reveals to see what's resonating with people. And if we talk about product reveals, you can sort of show people looking a certain shoe or a piece of apparel, and consumers will react, and you'll see what they react to and which ones they like, which ones they don't. And that can help inform your buy of which shoe you want to focus on or apparel that you want to focus on. Or you can also put people in the shoes and have them try and wear test it and see what are their first impressions of the product. And because that may be what you're going to focus on in your marketing campaign is like, if it's about being a soft shoe, maybe you use that word soft or highly cushioned or incredibly light. Like those are that language is a consumer language that you can bring into the product. And then there's a sort of a pass off that happens into marketing, and then marketing takes it and they sort of build out, and they can also perform sort of consumer research along that process and potentially some user research of what that sort of experience or shopper journey will be for that consumer. And then at the end, once you've sort of launched the product, there's a bunch of analytics that go into it of what worked and what didn't work, either from the marketing or the product side. And so there's a lot that happens in the back end that actually then brings you full circle up to the front in order to evolve that product for the next round. So there's consumer research plays everywhere, which is kind of fun and kind of exciting.
I'm just imagining you have notebooks filled with notes and details with all this.
Yeah. Yeah. I wish they were as clean as beautiful as I thought, but but I can't read any of my handwriting. But I have notebooks of writing I can't read.
I have the same problem. Can you tell me about maybe a memorable product you worked on or researched at Nike? What was that like? Is there anything that sticks out to you?
You know, one of my favorites. I have a bunch that I've loved throughout the years, but one of my favorites is it was interesting. So going back in time, let's go to 2010. There's been a shift in running, and we're getting a sense of this massive cultural shift away from this idea of a lone runner, like in suburban areas that are sort of just putting in distance and miles. And there's a whole shift that's happening to more urban running and in groups. And so this idea of run clubs was starting to sort of build and grow. And so I remember going to London, meeting with Charlie Dark, and who's the founder of Rundem Crew and very much an expert in this space, and talking to him about what the experience is like as runners in sort of urban locations and running with a run crew and what it means to be that culture, and loved it. And yeah, based on that discussion, we had all these great ideas that sort of came out of it. And One of the things we executed is before the 2012 Olympics in London, we brought, I think it was 8 running crews across the world together in London, and created a whole experience for them, including sort of these 100-meter dashes in a graffitied tube within London, where it was sort of paired matchups to see who the fastest one out of all the running crews was, and it ended up setting this tone of a very different vibe of what running is, or what running was, to where it's going. And I think you see a lot of that running crews sort of, they kind of quieted down a little bit, and they're coming back in a big way at the moment. But that was one of my favorites because it was fun to see that cultural shift and be on the front end of that shift.
Fascinating. Yeah. It seems like that's kind of where, like, you're living 2 or 3 years into the future, right?
Yes.
Like when you're, I mean, I guess anyone in the product world is.
Yeah.
But you're like kind of on the cusp of what could be next.
Yes. Always. You live in the moment with the consumer to try to understand that need, but the problem solving happens 2 years in advance. And so it sometimes feels like a race with other companies to see who's going to solve that problem first. But you live in multiple worlds.
So that's an interesting point. And I was curious about this. You mentioned a lot of companies are like, it's a race to solve the problem first for the consumer. When you're doing research, when do you know if you've uncovered something that's like the problem hasn't been identified before, versus maybe you're hearing the same problem and all your competitors are hearing the same problem also, and you're all working to try to solve it?
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. So, I'll take it. And I think one of the ways to think about it is, if there's an aha moment, then there's something there that people haven't been thinking about. There are lots of problems that we haven't solved yet. We haven't solved flying cars, for example. We all think of flying cars, and
that was supposed to be solved like 40 years ago.
Yeah, totally. According to Back to the Future. But but there are also these non-obvious things that once you sort of see it and go through it, you're like, oh, like, we have a problem we need to solve. And I'm happy to take you through an example if you want to go through an example.
Please.
Do you climb? Do you rock climb at all? Are you familiar?
I have rock climbed. I wish I did it more.
Okay. Are you familiar with what an ATC is?
Yes.
Okay. So it's interesting when you go to a climbing gym and you see sort of beginner climbers, and they're learning how to belay. So one person's climbing and one person's on the mat and sort of feeding out or pulling in rope to make sure the person's safe. In the beginning, I'm just going to throw it out there, are those people who are learning how to belay like calm and chill, or are they fairly stressed and like white knuckling the rope?
You can see every muscle in their body focusing on what they're doing.
Yeah, they're highly stressed and a lot of tension. So everybody sees that beginners have that tension. And if you were to solve that problem, you would probably give everybody Xanax for their first few lessons to remove that stress. But let's dive deeper. Why do you think those consumers are so stressed? Why are those belayers stressed?
I mean, the risk is high. The consequence is high for their climbing partner.
Yes. And so and the risk is, if you let go of the rope, what will happen to the person if they fall off?
They fall.
Yeah. And
bad news.
Let's say, potentially break something or die, right?
Yeah.
And so the observation is that beginning rock climbers are stressed while belaying and has a very stressful experience. The insight is, beginner rock climbers are stressed about their experience while rock climbing, because if they let go of the rope, their partner may die. And you're like, oh, I now have a much better understanding of why people are stressed about using an ATC. And so it creates this idea of, how might we solve that problem? How might we create a device that allows consumers to let go of the rope and still have the rock climber be safe? And so, are you familiar with what likely Petzl came up with in order to solve that?
Yeah, wasn't that the Gregory device?
Yeah, so the Gregory, which auto locks if you let go, which is great. And so it's that type of thinking that's sort of obvious. It's clear, everybody sees the same thing, but are able to layer in that deeper understanding to solve that deeper understanding, which is where you really get the innovation and something new and different in the marketplace. So that's just an example.
I see. So yeah, let's walk through like how would you conduct research if you were brought in to do so, or like what's the starting place, and then what are all the steps that you might take, and let's just kind of take it one step at a time.
Yeah, sure. If I'm going to actually back up. If you are in the industry, hopefully there's a somewhat of a plan. There's a what we call oftentimes a learning agenda. So you've got several seasons out. You're going to have to work on certain products during those seasons. I think it's really important to be able to sort of understand what those questions are that you will have during those different steps. And so you have a little bit of a roadmap going forward of what research you will sort of conduct on, let's say, a quarterly basis or a seasonal basis. Um, and now why I start there is because each of those questions may be different based on what you're building or product you're sort of creating. And so sometimes if you're looking for the evolution of a product, what's the next step? You may have to do some just basic qualitative research. Maybe you pull in some quantitative research and sort of evolve that product. But if you are looking to do some more a more revolutionary sort of perspective of products, so really innovate things, then typically you're going to do a lot of qualitative research. So going out into the field and try to understand that sort of problem and need.
So if you were, say, developing a new shoe, like what might be some common questions that you would like the entire team might be asking?
Yeah, we would ask, what are you currently running in, and where are you currently running? And then you sort of you want to establish some rapport with them and learn some basic information. But at the same time, you want to make sure that the consumers are talking about real world experiences, not necessarily fake experiences, because people don't buy or live in a fake world. They live in the world that they live in. And so asking them questions about where they run, so you get a sense of trail, etc. It helps you with questions later. What shoe they're running in gives you a good reference point. And then simply asking about their experience, but not, you don't ask them, hey, what's your experience? But you ask them, what do you love about your shoe? What's your favorite part about your shoe? If you were to change one thing, what would you change? Tell me, when last time you were on the trail, when was the last time you noticed your footwear and you found it distracting to you? And so you start to have these sort of good probing questions that sort of get after a little bit of those friction points without saying, what's your friction point with your shoe?
I see. Well, if you could eliminate friction points on shoes, then you'd have a pretty
Yeah.
pretty killer product.
Yeah, everybody. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so after discussion guide, yeah, what's your next tip? Where do you go from there?
So discussion guide, second is, or third probably, is going out into field. And when going out into field, I highly recommend trying to eliminate as much bias as you can. And oftentimes you see people going out into field, and especially if you're with a company and you're with a team of people, everybody shows up head to toe in the apparel and footwear of that company. And oftentimes it's like the nicest product that company makes. And that brings a ton of bias into these conversations, because the consumer sees that and they're like, oh, they must be from that brand. I want to tailor my answers so that I have some approval from these people and sort of gear my answers toward them instead of talking about what matters to them most. And, so try to eliminate that. Just show up and be neutral. Again, the other thing about error and bias is this is not about you. You are not as the product person or the marketer, you are not the subject. The subject is the person that's in front of you, and it's really about learning from them. So try not to overshare information. People can talk about their last hardcore experience they did over the weekend, and that creates sort of a lot of intimidation potentially, or the need to sort of play into that rather than just, again, having that sort of sense of what's really happening in their world and gathering that information.
Have there been studies done? Does if I'm wearing a Nike T-shirt, does that sway my answers to you?
Generally, yes. I haven't seen a Nike study on it, but that is a common, one that's been studied a ton. That it's people are seek approval and they end up changing their answers in order to be approved and feel part of that group and that tribe.
I see.
So, and what ties to that is also when you're in field, I highly recommend that you debrief every day with your team. And so it's interesting to watch how you, as a researcher, you gather all this information during the day. And if you don't debrief at the end of the day, you go to sleep and your mind does an amazing job of basically filtering out a ton of information and just remembering 2 to 3 things from the prior day. So it's really important to debrief with your team and say, hey, here's everything we learned. Here's what we think we should adjust in the discussion guide. Like, this was a fascinating point. Let's double click on that in future ones. Great. And make that happen.
Do you ever record conversations?
Oh, absolutely. And so consumer research is great when one person hears it, but if you can find a way for other people to see it and hear it, it is even better. And if you think about asking a kid to tie a shoe, I can describe how a kid can tie a shoe. But when you actually watch a kid tie a shoe in a video, it's a whole different experience. So capturing that information is not only good as a refresher for you as the researcher of what's happening when you get back and need to synthesize this all down, but it's also really helpful in order to convey to your stakeholders throughout the organization of what's actually happening with the consumer, because this is their world. You don't have to paint their picture, that picture just in words.
Gotcha. You had mentioned earlier this idea of an insight versus an observation. I'm assuming this is when you start to uncover some of these. Can you describe what those are in more detail?
Yeah. So we sort of talked about that observation is that factual thing about the consumer, and the insight is that deeper understanding of the why that's behind it. And when you're out in field, typically you are pulling in just a lot of observations. It's the design thinking process. It's an expansionary thought. So it's not about judgment. It's about pulling in all these new ideas and seeing the breadth of what the consumer is telling you. You reserve judgment for later, which is the second half. When you get back, you sort of converge all of this information, and oftentimes you can run a observation to insights workshop, which is, if people aren't familiar, there's lots of different ways you could run this, but you often see it with sticky notes, where you put an observation on a sticky note, and everybody shares on the team what those are, and then you group them together into sort of themes, and then based on those themes, you develop insights for each of them. And then once you've sort of chosen one insight, then you build a how might we off of that. And so how might we, again, create a belay device that auto locks, and that then sort of starts the product creation and prototyping process to help solve it with the actual product. And so there's a bunch of different processes that happen, but that's often what happens. The other thing that happens is oftentimes it's just a synthesization of the information into a deck that you end up communicating to stakeholders for them to then take action off of.
I see. How do you know when you have enough data? How do you know when you can come back and have enough to go through and actually make an informed decision?
Yeah, once you start to hear it repeated several times, you know you're good. You can push pause and say, all right, I see this error, this challenge has occurred several times and has come up several times. All right, we're good. We don't need to do a ton more research. It's time for us to probably move on. And so once you see it 3-4 times, that's probably enough for you to move on.
Interesting. And so that doesn't matter. Your sample size doesn't need to be that large. Like, you could talk to 20 people, and if you hear it 3 times, it's just as reliable as 1,000 people.
Well, you will use them in almost two different ways. The qualitative portion, it's hard to talk to 1,000 people on the qual side, right? An hour-long interview with 1,000 people is a lot of research.
You don't have that much time?
I don't have that much time. But if you were able to sort of, you find it in the 20 people, and you're able to see that, hey, this is a reoccurring theme. Oftentimes you will then actually perform quantitative research to say, all right, is this theme that we're hearing now accessible in the 1,000 people? And that's where you sort of get that scope and scale to say, all right, this is a bigger problem that we do see. But so you use mixed methodologies in order to prove one and see if it exists in others.
I see. Interesting. So then you come back to the office and you start to synthesize everything into what are the themes you're noticing?
Yes. And so again, that could be the workshop, or the other thing is just honestly putting together a presentation in order to communicate that. And that's a tricky process. I think that's where most people in terms of the research fall down. It's really important to start your presentations from that consumer lens. And it's oftentimes we are product people, we're marketers, we have opinions. It's easy for us to say, I feel the consumer is doing this, or I believe the consumer is this. But when you use words like that, then it puts people's belief systems sort of against each other, or you're challenging. Open yourself up for the opportunity to be challenged. Where if you go into the presentation and say, "Hey, the consumer said this," you can't really refute that. That's literally what the consumer was saying. And so starting with the consumer really helps presentations. And it takes people out of their thinking of their perspective of, let's say we're studying running, their experience while running, instead of the consumer's experience from running. So it reorients them in that way. And you kind of want to create like a storyline, like a movie. There should be a story that the stakeholder follows, and it's a good, simple story. It's deep and rich. It's interesting, but it's also not like a 5-hour long movie. This is not like an epic thing, because people don't have the time or energy to sort of pull in that much information. So it is about the synthesis down to like a very specific key set of points that people need to know and be aware of. And then when you communicate that, make sure to bridge the gap in terms of what this can do and how this can be helpful for that stakeholder. So it's not enough just to say that people like this. What's helpful is to say people like this, so we should create a shoe that does that. And sort of bridging that gap for people can be really helpful in terms of turning that insight into action throughout the organization.
Whose responsibility is it to verify if the recommendation is aligned with the brand and the direction of the brand? Is that your responsibility as the researcher? Is that someone else's decision?
It should be everybody's. The researchers should have enough knowledge of the organization and what they're focused on, et cetera. That comes through in the brief in the beginning and what's trying to be researched. And if you are a researcher, and if you're a product or a design person, you already are ingrained in it, you should have that sort of sense to begin with. But once you have that point of view, again, this is just the consumer's perspective and point of view. What's interesting then is when you bring like the leadership team and say, all right, how are we going to take that and make that specific to the brand? Because brands can take that in lots of different directions. You could focus on comfort, you could focus on speed, you could focus on traction. There's lots of ways that you can pull it, but what makes the most sense for the brand? And that's where a lot of the fun also decisions get made.
You mentioned that you have your students working on a 2-year-long research process. Does it usually take 2 years?
No, not the research. They end up creating a product that they will get prototypes for.
Okay.
And this is just the beginning, is the consumer research. So we start really fast at the beginning to try to understand what consumer challenges are.
Okay, gotcha. It seems like if you have this in place, like every product should be a win.
You hope so. At least not a failure, not a big failure. If you're able to conduct effective research, right? Like sometimes people do research and it's not effective, and then things go a little astray or off. But if you can conduct that research and you are continually solving those consumer problems, and you have to answer other problems. Is it the right price? Do you have the right distribution, et cetera? You should have some sense of security in developing that product.
If you had to generalize, like how many products are out there? How many of them have been researched? How many of them are just someone had an idea while they were in their shower one day?
Yeah, I would say the majority of people are, not majority, but a lot of them are ideas in showers that you see in the beginning phases. But once you're ingrained in like a company and doing this, most of the time, at least that I see, people have a passion for what they're doing. You have a passion for what you're working on. And as a result, you're reading about it, you're thinking about it, you're seeing it in different places. So even you may not necessarily be talking to consumers all of the time, you are getting exposure to what's happening in the culture and the marketplace that will help inform those decisions. That being said, the idea of going out and talking to consumers, that's a pretty big hurdle for people to go do. And so there's a lot fewer of that's happening.
So if you look at the outdoor industry, like everyone, I'm going to generalize significantly here, but like everyone sells a tent, everyone sells a jacket, everyone sells, a pant. Like and I get that those are necessities and everyone needs those, but where's where do you find the cutting edge, really interesting development happening? Like, where do you see that happening today? And how much of that is being driven by research? I think about like, there's a cottage, Lloyd Vogel runs, garage grown gear. It's like a cottage industry that represents a number of like super small makers. But I look at their website and there's just so many super niche things that are being developed. And maybe those are more of the idea that a founder has while they're on a trail and they experience a problem. But I guess I'm trying to figure out what my question is exactly, but I think I'm just trying to understand, like, where do we see innovation, and do you feel like our industry could be more innovative? Are we innovating quite well, or what's your evaluation of that?
Yeah. If you think about, I think in some ways we're very innovative at the moment. In some ways we are not innovative. And it's the products that we've had. And it's not even that's not always the case, but I agree with jackets. It seems ubiquitous at the moment in terms of everybody offers a waterproof, seam sealed jacket. But what's truly unique and different about those products, and is there enough that's being done to sort of change that? And in some ways, it feels like everybody just goes and pushes for more waterproofness and more seam sealing. Not that there can be more, but it always, again, that seems like an echo chamber that sort of people are following that pattern where, I don't know. When I think of jackets, I'm interested in the opposite question of how do you stay warm while wet? Inevitably students will come and they'll say, I want to study, because I live in Portland, Oregon. It's always rainy in the fall, and they want to solve the problem of, let's say, running and being wet while running. And are we really looking at it the right way of, like, no matter what, you're going to be wet. Like, you're either going to get rain on you or you're going to sweat. You're not going to mitigate. You're never going to answer that problem. But I think the better question could be, like, how do you stay warm while wet? Like, what products are we creating that actually make wet feel comfortable or feel good? And that's a whole different perspective that we can bring to it and see it. But what you see is these smaller companies are like, hey, that is not enough. I need something different. And therefore they are creating that innovation, which then potentially then permeates those bigger companies that are out there.
Yeah, interesting. Can you share a little bit about how some of this data and these findings then go on to influence marketing? Like, what's the handoff between insights and product to insights and marketing?
Yeah. I think this is sort of a big problem we have in our industry, is that a lot of research is done in the beginning in order to find out why we need to develop the product or what that challenge is. And then it ends up being a moment in time rather than something that lives with the product as it moves along that product cycle. And so what you see is oftentimes they have that moment, then they go build the product, and then they hand it off to marketing, and they're like, here's this amazing product. And marketing's like, all right, how are we going to talk about it? Like, what's the proposition? And they go do more research, and it ends up being a slightly different story than what the intent was. And then the marketing doesn't match the product that actually goes to market at the end of the day. And so I think the big challenge for a lot of these companies is how do you have that insight live with that product as it gets passed off from a PLM to a designer to the merchant to the product, to the marketing team, and then the marketing team into the sales team in the field, to be able to help communicate that it lives consistently. And I think that's one that I think everybody has the opportunity to become better at.
Where have you seen that work well? Any ideas as to how to improve that?
Typically things that have faster life cycles to get to market. So 2 years, let's say it's 2 years, that's a long time. But if you think of classic CPG companies, they've got, days to weeks before they go to market. And so when there's that immediacy, it sort of travels a little bit easier. It's the length of time that kind of gets it. And the downside is it's the red thread that holds everything together is the consumer insight. I would argue it's not the product, it's the insight that should be the thing that everybody hangs on to. And the product is just the solution to it.
Yeah. Interesting. If you could help our industry with one thing, like if you could leave one kind of lasting footprint on the industry, like what would you want would you want them to like do better research, more research? Not like what do you hope for the research industry.
Yeah. If I was to choose one thing, I would choose to put the consumer first. Always put the consumer first. And if you do that, you will end up in a pretty good place all of the time. But a lot of times we don't see people putting the consumer first. And that's, again, what leads into a lot of the challenges that we see with companies.
Is that because we assume we being the internal team, we assume that we are the customer?
Yep. So that's one of them. The other one you kind of see sometimes is you put investors first. So if you're sort of the bigger public companies, you need to sell a lot of product. And so you create product that will sometimes sell, but it may hurt your brand at the end of the day. And it's not necessarily putting your consumer first about meeting them and keeping a sustainable relationship with that consumer over the long term. And there are a bunch of brands out there that have this problem. And just keeping that consumer first mentality will sort of keep that longer term connection with that consumer.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about? I'm sure there's lots of other like nitty gritty details when it comes to conducting research that we haven't been able to get into, but anything else big picture that you think is...
Any other big picture? Yeah, consumer research, there's so much we could uncover and talk about. But we've kind of hit on the good high points. I think the only other thing I would add is that this is the other friction, is I don't believe consumer research should live with just consumer researchers. I think that is such a misnomer, and not doing enough service to all of our product people, our merchants, our designers, our brand folks. Let me put it this way. It's a skill set that's on their performance reviews, right? Like, it is something that they should be versed in. And we oftentimes just like wipe our hands clean and say, hey, this is for consumer research to solve, but I don't have enough budget or money, so I'm not going to go do it. This is all something that we could own. And so I think one of my passions is sort of bringing that to everybody and making sure everybody feels comfortable and confident being out there.
I think that's generally a good thing. If people ask more questions than pretend to know things.
100%.
And yeah, that could permeate,
all of life.
All of life. That'd probably be a good thing.
Yeah.
Steve, I want to thank you for walking us through a really like very niche topic, but something that has profound effect on everything that we do. I mean, this industry exists because it's here to serve people. I guess that's true for every industry, hopefully. If folks want to follow along with you, if they want to learn more about your business and your consulting practice, if students are listening and they want to be like, hey, I want Steve to teach me, where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Stephen Holmberg on LinkedIn. You can also find, I write a Substack called The Field Report, that you can find it there. And then finally, I have a website, so stephenholmberg.com. You can find out more information there. But thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation, and happy to come back again.
Well, I suspect we'll have maybe part 2 will go deeper. We'll go down the rabbit hole. I want to be out there in the field with you and watch you conduct research.
I think
fun.
That would be really. I think it's cool. The best. It's one of the best parts of what we get to do is actually being with consumers.
That would actually be an interesting podcast, recording interviews with researchers while they're talking to people out in the field and then publishing it all.
Yeah, let's do it. I'm in.
All right. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Have a good one. Bye.